Welcome back. Thanks for coming. I want to special thanks to Mira Debs for organizing that transcendent panel with teachers yesterday afternoon. Mira does it all here, runs education studies, brings thermoses full of chai for a special colleague here who needed chai this morning. I mean, now that's a former teacher who learned how to go left, go right, go straight, go whatever. All right, real quick introduction of this panel. Michelle and I, in pulling together this conference, would have these moments where either on the phone or an email or sometimes in our office, we would say something like, Perlstein said yes, Nancy MacLean's coming, you know, or Kim Crenshaw's coming, you know, and because we work, you know, hard to get all these smart and amazing people to come for this, and they did. In fact, I can't remember anybody who said no, to think of it, and we're not exactly paying them a lot of money for this. It's just a special panel here. I mean, obviously this is about teachers, their experiences, their challenges, their lives, the politics they face today. That's the core of this, but we, of course, obviously wanted to do short-term and long-term context, historical context, and it just seemed imperative that we pull together this amazing group of scholars of American conservatism, the American right, however we want to label this. So quickly, I'm going to try to do this in the order they will speak, and they created their own order here. It was wonderful. Four historians talking chronology. I mean, doesn't get any more exciting than that. Bev Gage is my colleague here at Yale, a very special colleague. I'm going to start with the fact that she's won teaching awards. She single-handedly, when she was director of undergraduate education, she single-handedly sort of revamped the history department's curriculum, which is a hard task with those people. Hot off the press, let me have it. I mean, literally, she got her first copy yesterday. G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. And as Bev said to me, everybody's dad needs a book for Christmas. She said that. That's true. This is a new biography of Hoover, arguably one of the most powerful people of the 20th century, and has been working on this book for some time. I know about 10-year biographies. She's also the author of The Day Wall Street Exploded, a story of America in its first age of terror, which was her first book. She's commentator all over the place in the popular press, as is everyone here. She used to run the Brady Johnson program in grand strategy here at Yale for about 4 or 5 years. She was nominated by President Biden to serve on the National Humanities Council. Did her BA here at Yale and her PhD at Columbia. And Bev teaches a very popular course here on the history of conservatism. I'm not sure if that's the exact title, but close. Second will be Nancy MacLean. Is that right? Did I have that order right? Yes.
Oh, no, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jennifer. Okay.
Perlstein.
Rick. All right. I see. I can't do chronology this early. Rick Perlstein is a journalist and an author who had the good sense to quit graduate school and just write great books. He's the author of many works, most of them bestsellers. The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan. No, I'm sorry. The title is The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan. And then the huge book, Nixonland, The Rise of a President and the Fracturing of America. He's also written a book, Before the Storm, Buried Goldwater. And, man, living with this crowd of people most of your life, Rick. A lot of bills to a shrink, I'm sure. But anyway, he's won all kinds of book awards for this, including the LA Times Book Award, commentator in popular press all over the place. And he's a contributing editor and board member of These Times, and he lives in Chicago. Then it's Nancy. Got it? Okay. Nancy MacLean is the William Chafe Distinguished Professor at Duke, of History at Duke. She used to teach at Northwestern. She too has won teaching awards. This is, we're teachers too. She's the author of Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. You can tell here, we got the right people on this. That book was a finalist for the National Book Award in nonfiction. I know what that means. I once chaired the nonfiction National Book Award, and just reaching the finalists was climbing a mountain for our little group. And we could have given it to any one of the books. I wasn't on that group, Nancy, so you can't blame me. It did win the LA Times Book Award, the Lillian Smith Book Award, and so on. She's also the author of Freedom is Not Enough, The Opening of the American Workplace, and Mask of Chivalry, The Making of the Second Ku Klux Klan, the book on the Klan in the 20s. It is the book on the more modern Klan. She too writes for everything from The Atlantic to The Nation, and all kinds of radio programs and so on. She has won teaching awards both for an undergraduate teacher and a graduate teacher. Just not a feat everybody can claim. And then our colleague here at Yale, at least for this year and maybe longer if we can keep her, Jennifer Berkshire. Thank you for cheering. She's the Block Lecturer in Education and Journalism and a lecturer in Education Studies here at Yale. She holds both adjunct positions at Boston College and here at Yale. She's a proud Midwesterner. And when I read that in your bio, I said, now come on, name where you're from. And then I kept reading Illinois. Good, I'm a proud Midwesterner. And in her bio, she says she's a proud Midwesterner. By God, that's, Heartlander. I love that. I gotta use that one. She's a scholar of public schools and public education. She writes for all sorts of journals like the New Republic, the New York Times, The Nation, and others. And she's the author of A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, The Dismantling of Public Education and the Future of Schools, as well as the book More Worlds to Negotiate, John Dunlap and the Art of Problem Solving. Jennifer is here this year, part of Education Studies, and indeed played a role along with Mira in helping us organize this conference. And I should say too, the wonderful Carol Anderson was going to be part of this panel, author of many books on voting rights and on her famous book, White Rage. But she flew into New York on Thursday only to get a message that her brother had died. She turned right around, flew back to Atlanta. So keep our thoughts on Carol Anderson, a dear friend and somebody in incredible demand these days. But she was coming for the whole weekend. Anyway, in Carol's absence, I told everybody I could have 2 more minutes. Welcome, everybody. Go ahead.
All right, well, thanks to David and the panel and to all of you for being here for this really important and fascinating discussion. It's funny, David, I remember when we were on a biography panel together 5-10 years ago, a long time ago. We were both working on these, and I remember at that point pointing out that David was writing a biography of one of the most admired, widely claimed figures in American history. And I was writing a biography of one of the most reviled, most hated figures in American history. And that actually gives you pretty different relationships with your biographical subjects. But at any rate,
You're still nice.
That's right. And I have finally caught up to David being the point there. Anyway, it's a great honor and pleasure to be here. And I thought that I would just talk a little bit about some of the teaching that I do here at Yale and about some of the connections that I see between the politics that we're experiencing in this moment and the kind of political history that I think about and teach about. And I wanted to start by just picking up on something that was said yesterday in the panel, I think in particular by Erica Lee, but by many other people in many other panels, which is what students know and what they don't know. I'm teaching a seminar right now on the history of liberalism and conservatism in the United States in the 20th century. There are actually a couple of students here from that seminar. And my experience is that often students come in knowing quite a lot about one half of that equation, which actually is the liberalism half. They're very familiar with the New Deal. They're pretty familiar with the progressive era. They're quite familiar with the civil rights movement. But while they may have been immersed in conservative ideas, watching certain forms of conservatism certainly play out in American politics, it's not something that for the most part they have studied as a formal subject, as a movement, as a set of institutions and organizations and ideas. And so for most of my students, I think, looking at conservative thinkers, institutions, ideas, trends as a formal subject is really pretty surprising, pretty new, and I think it's very much related to what we're all doing in this conference, that you can't think about race, you can't think about slavery and about teaching those histories without thinking in some way about this formal set of and informal set of institutions and ideas that we might put under the category of conservatism or the right. Today, I want to talk in particular about one aspect of modern conservatism, which is the history of anti-communism, of opposition to quote unquote Marxism, which has been an important part of the American conservative tradition. And I wanted to start just by reading a quote. In America, many Marxists cloak themselves in phrases like progressives, democratic socialists, social activists, community activists, etc., as most Americans remain openly hostile to the name Marxism. They operate under myriad newly minted organizational or identifying nomenclatures, such as Black Lives Matter, Antifa, the Squad, etc. And they claim to promote economic justice, environmental justice, racial equity, gender equity. They have invented new theories like critical race theory and phrases and terminologies linked to or fit into a Marxist construct. Moreover, they claim the dominant culture and capitalist system are unjust and inequitable, racist and sexist, colonialist and imperialist, materialistic and destructive of the environment. And I could go on at some length. So this quote, which I think very much resonates with earlier political moments, is from a book that was the #1 best-selling book in the United States in the last couple of years. It's a book called American Marxism by a Fox News commentator, Mark Levin. And I think that we want to understand where this political language comes from, why it has so much power, and I think why it has so much currency on the right today. One of the things that I'm going to talk about toward the end of the speech is the way in which, while I think we've paid a lot of attention to anti-critical race theory laws that have been passed, those are often being passed in places like Florida or Oklahoma, or discussions in New Hampshire, elsewhere, within this bigger context of being sort of anti-Marxist, anti-communist, and that has often in American history been linked to attempts to push back movements for racial justice, for gender justice, for environmental justice. This list that we have here. Those are links that go back a long ways. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that history, and in particular about two trends that I've seen that I think we are seeing play out today. One is the rise of repressive laws aimed at teachers, aimed at the educational system, and the other is the rise of kind of new forms of patriotic pageantry, new forms of kind of affirmation of the American story that have often come out of these moments of anti-communist, anti-socialist ideological reaction. So I think in a lot of ways you can trace those back to the moment of the Bolshevik Revolution, back to 1917, 18, 19, 20, which is a period that is not only the First World War in the United States, but is the rise of the first Red Scare in the United States. And there are a couple of things that happen in that moment, in addition to deportation raids, in addition to some of the kind of more famous moments of conflict that I think are worth thinking about for this conference in particular. One is that it's the moment that many states begin to pass the first versions of teacher loyalty oaths. Many municipalities begin to do that, and many teachers begin to get fired from their jobs for having some variant of kind of left-leaning, left-wing ideas. Sometimes those are people who belong to objectionable organizations. Sometimes they are people who are trying to do some of the things that many of you in this room are doing, which is to change the curriculum, to bring in stories about race and justice in an explicit way. When I was doing the research for my first book, I came across a set of teacher purges in the New York City school system. During this period, my own grandfather was a New York City public school teacher. He taught at a place called DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx. It is still there. And in the archives, there it was, DeWitt Clinton High School firing many of its suspect teachers in this very early period. So I think we can trace a lot of kind of this restrictive legislation back to much earlier moments in American history, and this was one of them. The other thing that happens in this moment is an invention of new holidays, new rituals, new curricula that are supposed to come in and deliver kind of a more conservative message, that are supposed to kind of bolster American patriotism. One of the holidays that is invented in this moment as a federal holiday is Constitution Day, which is created in 1919 as a response to anxieties about the Bolshevik Revolution, anxieties about the idea that socialists and communists have these big ideas. Americans aren't affirming their own traditions, their own histories. And it's been interesting for me as a historian to know those origins and to watch since 9/11 kind of the revival of requirements that you have to do stuff on Constitution Day. So certainly in higher ed, and I suspect in K-12 education as well, but you all can tell me, there are now requirements that if you receive federal funding, you have to observe Constitution Day in some way or another. And that, as I said, has this 100-year or more history. The last thing that I will point out about this earlier period is that many of the critical events, things that Professor MacLean has written about, many others, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, the creation of immigration restriction in the 1920s, while we want to think about those in terms of race and racial discrimination, racial hierarchy, eugenics in that moment, we also want to think about this language of kind of anti-communism, anti-socialism, right? There's a deep concern that people from other lands are going to bring their subversive ideas into the United States. That includes subversive ideas about how the economy ought to work, subversive ideas about race, subversive ideas about a lot of things. It's one of the drivers of immigration restriction. And of course, the Klan really comes together, not only around anti-Catholicism and racism and white supremacy, but around this new anti-communist language that's developing. So that's one moment that I think is a useful reference point for us. A second moment, unsurprisingly, would be the period of the 1940s and 50s, the rise of McCarthyism. In my J. Edgar Hoover book, I'm trying to make the case that McCarthy is a little bit of a distraction for us. He comes and goes pretty quickly. He's sort of a demagogue, but he's not much of an institution builder, whereas people like J. Edgar Hoover are there before Joe McCarthy, they're there during Joe McCarthy, they're there after Joe McCarthy, and they're actually creating a set of laws and institutions that still shape both what teachers are able to do, how we're able to think about these issues in particular, but also is really shaping very deeply every social movement in the United States from this moment on, from movements on the left to some degree, movements on the right, movements for racial justice and civil rights. But a couple of things, again, happen in the 1940s that I think are worth thinking about. So one is, this is another moment of a rush to codify teacher loyalty laws. And in fact, many of those teacher loyalty oaths and teacher loyalty laws are still on the books today. Some of you may have taken them. It's been a controversy in the UC system that these kind of Cold War loyalty oaths have in recent years, I'm not sure what the status is now, but have still been required of teachers. In many places, public school teachers often take these kinds of loyalty oaths. And at the same time, you see figures like Hoover engaging in kind of affirmative, propagandistic visions of the United States and its history and what it's supposed to be. And Hoover, I think, is a particularly interesting figure because he both has his hands on sort of the massive repressive apparatus of the FBI. And in fact, the FBI begins a whole new program in the 40s and 50s that ends up being aimed particularly at teachers, both public school teachers and teachers in higher education. It's known as the Responsibilities Program, in which the FBI is feeding information to governors, to school chancellors, to local school boards and local politicians about suspect teachers who are then quietly eased out of their jobs by the hundreds during the 1940s and 50s. So we have both this kind of repressive apparatus, once again, and this kind of more affirmative apparatus coming out of that moment as well. By the late 50s and early 60s, there's a real reaction to some of the more repressive aspects of McCarthyism. But I think it's important to note about the origins of the modern right and the origins of something that becomes formally known as the modern conservative movement, which really takes root in this formal sense in the 1950s, that a lot of the motivating factor behind that was the fact that someone like Joe McCarthy had been repudiated, that people at the grassroots were going to have to pick up this anti-communist cause, which again was wrapped up, as you might imagine, in the 50s and 60s in all sorts of things, including movements for racial justice. And in fact, at the FBI, this kind of anti-communist logic becomes the way into some of the very famous forms of policing of civil rights movements, civil rights figures, that becomes so prominent and escalated in the 50s and 60s. The FBI first begins to go after Martin Luther King because they believe that he is being counseled and working with people who had been members of the Communist Party, in particular its secret apparatus. This is a lot of the language and logic for going after the Black Panthers in the late part of the 1960s. But for the conservative movement, this language of anti-communism really becomes a way to draw together a very broad coalition of people that in many ways are still the coalition that is at the heart of the Republican Party, both people in the white South who switched from the Democrats to the Republican Party in a kind of anti-communist, anti-federal power vision, and other forms of conservatives as well. So it's a powerful language. It's been a powerful language for the right. It's been a language that brings together a lot of different issues, as that quote suggested from Mark Levin, and it is still a language that is being deployed in all sorts of legislative restrictions that are happening around the country. I have a quote from Ron DeSantis, who is making this case very nicely for me in thinking about some of the anti-critical race theory laws, many Florida teachers in the room, some of the things that you're dealing with. And this is DeSantis speaking on Sean Hannity's show, Critical race theory is basically teaching people to hate our country, to hate each other. It's divisive, and it's basically an identity politics version of Marxism, right? So we're now 30 years out from the end of the Cold War. There is no more Communist Party in the United States in any functional, formal sense. And yet this powerful language is still present, particularly on the right, and is present in much of this legislation today. So we have that piece that is still here, and we also have this piece that takes us back to communism. I mentioned Constitution Day in 1919. One of the things that DeSantis has done that I think has gotten less publicity is that he has also declared that Florida is going to honor something called Victims of Communism Day. Victims of Communism Day is now an official day in Florida. It's November 7th. It's the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, which is, as I said, where we were with Constitution Day in its early years. So I think it's really important to understand the ongoing power of this language and its implications in creating the modern right, but also within the right as it exists in the 21st century, 3 decades out from the end of the Cold War. Thank you.
Bev, thanks for reminding me. When I was hired in Flint, I'll give you the year, I had to take a look. I did take a look, and it was done with a kind of apology, but you gotta raise your hand. I actually took a look. And, sorry.
I hate these arena-style classrooms because it makes it look like I have a bald spot. I swear I don't. David, I'm thrilled I said yes. Yesterday, it kind of sunk in that I'd be addressing teachers. I love my academic friends, but I don't think I've ever really had the opportunity to talk to a group of elementary and high school teachers. I'm not sure we've recognized them. So maybe we should give like the teachers who are like kind of like fighting this battle at the bloody crossroads a round of applause. So yes, I am a historian who has spent 25 years studying the right, both as a historian in the archives, but also as a journalist, covering the Bush administration. And I think I was the first to write an article musing over whether Donald Trump was a fascist or not in the summer of 2015. And one of my readers once boiled my thousands of pages and hundreds of articles down to 11 words. There's always more and it's always worse, but it's never new. I think at History 101, you call that continuity and change, right? I would add one more thing. The challenge of the work that I do, and Bev and David and Nancy and everyone who writes about the right, is achieving empathy, right? We've talked about that. But also the more challenging part of that is not getting lost in the empathy that we surrender judgment, moral judgment, political judgment. I don't know if some of you who are public employees can say it, but I write as a liberal to advance the cause of liberalism. And I think that when liberalism has operational control of our local, state, and federal governments, we flourish. So this is, for me, as a political project. I'm going to begin by talking about an even deeper wellspring for some of these things that you guys are experiencing in the Bolshevik Revolution. After 25 years of doing this, I've been able to drill down to some real realities about conservatives that are really never going to go away. I mean, there's never not going to be these issues because they touch deeply human fears that are quite nearly primordial. Controversies over schooling are a perfect illustration of some of these. I expressed them in a recent piece you can look up from a publication called Forum magazine that the editors chose to entitle, "They Want Your Child." Writers don't choose the titles, right? Public schools are where young people encounter ways of being and thinking that may directly contradict those they were raised to believe. There is really no way around it. Schools are where future adults receive tools to decide which ideas and practices to embrace in which to reject for themselves. Schooling done properly is the opposite of conservatism. So is it any wonder that it frequently drives conservatives berserk? Now, I'm not saying you should go to school and end up a liberal. One of the things the way I conclude this piece is, if a student entertains the possibilities for self-moral and political and sociological development and decides to return to the values of home, they do so with a much stronger foundation, and you're going to have a much more durable conservative identity than one that's, imposed by, say, a Becca curriculum. The other fact that mints conservatism in modern life is that this is kind of like a Weberian thing. We can't manage everything in our lives and our families' lives all for ourselves. Processes that might once have happened around the family hearth or around the close confines of a village fire are outsourced to a group of strangers we call experts. And no matter how humane, public-spirited, and responsive those experts try to be, the fact that sending a child out into the hands of these people who may or may not share your values is going to be anxiety-producing. I don't have any children myself, but I hear it's pretty anxiety-producing for all of us. Thus, moral panics over schooling, which really have unfolded like clockwork in just about every decade of the 20th century. You can see it in some of the titles of the books. From 1923, Hell and the High School. 1948, They Want Your Child. 1958, Brainwashing in the High Schools. 1964, What Are They Doing to Your Children? Max Rafferty's book. He became the public education administrator elected in California. And then there's, I had to throw this in, the imperishable 1968 volume, Is the Schoolhouse the Proper Place to Teach Raw Sex?
Bet that's sold.
You can get it on eBay for about 50 cents. Since these dispensations are so powerfully true, so basic, so ineluctable, they're always there to be weaponized by ideological entrepreneurs. That's the constant. But what really has evolved since, I'm not going to say the 1920s, because the weaponization in the case of the Second Ku Klux Klan was, of course, epic. They ran several states, and one of their crusades was, shutting down the Catholic school system, which actually was a boon to public schools, ironically enough. What has evolved a great deal, let's say, since some of those hilarious book titles, is the depth, aggression, and sophistications of the institutions that do the weaponizing. That really is kind of the body of the historiography I've written. And racial reform has been one of the most powerful spurs to this sort of dynamic. We heard Donald Iacovone, his extraordinary presentation on racism in American history books. Then books started coming out that told a different story. And one of the first was an 8th grade textbook that was 600, 700 pages, co-authored by a name that came up yesterday, John Hope Franklin. You can read about it in his memoir, which was also mentioned. The right went absolutely nuts, and conservatives did serious organizing about it. One manifestation was a pamphlet from a group called Facts in Education. Let's drill down that language, facts, right? They're not giving an interpretation. It's these guys who are distorting history, the quote unquote revisionists. There's a kind of Protestant fundamentalist way of reading texts and history that's just there. You can, kind of do your own research, and it is transparent to every person. You don't need an expert to interpret it. Jill Lepore wrote really well about this in her book on how the Tea Party thinks about the Constitution. The Facts in Education pamphlet said that the book, Home of the Free, the first not to, teach that slaves were happy and Reconstruction was a disaster, quote, destroys pride in America's past, ... mocks American justice, projects negative thought models, criticizes business and free enterprise, plays politics, foments class hatreds, slants and distorts facts, and promotes propaganda. That's Ruffini, that's J. Edgar Hoover, that's Mark Levin. And this is the most important one. I kind of left out one of the ... Forces in students to, quote, develop a guilt complex. So that's a huge thing we hear again and again in the rhetoric of DeSantis, that it's anti-white, pro-black, makes white people feel bad, so we're going to pass a law against people developing a guilt complex. You want to know how sophisticated those methods have become in the intervening years. Then there was a film strip, the state-of-the-art teaching technology, in which you kind of get a deck of slides, right? And you kind of beep, you get a beep, there'd be a tape voiceover, and then you kind of beep when you do the slide.
Using them.
Yeah. It was called Education or Indoctrination. It was put up by a group called Publius and Associates, which is incredibly fascinating because Publius was the name under which the Federalist Papers were written. So they're kind of claiming the warrant of the founders of the country, the real history. But you can really think of it as a political technology of dissemination, like tweets or Fox News or direct mail. Your Rotary Club might get it, the Republican Club meeting, women's group. I found a news item from 1968 in which was presented at kind of a local chapter of, quote, Western Pennsylvania parents to protect our youth from propaganda, brainwashing, and subversive textbooks in our schools. Now, this stuff is funny. We're laughing. But I chose actually not to play the video because the video is so kitschy and so dated, you can't but laugh. But, it's not funny, right? Because this is still happening. The thought processes, the language, the consequences. They talk a lot about, like all forgotten Cold War things like loyalty oaths. The fact that the textbook doesn't talk about the victims of communism. Well, I guess what's old is new on that one too. But let's actually, Daniel, if you can just kind of cue the beginning and just kind of give people a sense of it for the first 5 or 10 seconds. Let's try not to. That's an example, Professor.
Here in New England, the cradle of America, the Pilgrims landed. The shot heard round the world was fired, and early Americans fought for and won the freedom we each enjoy today. Here were established America's first churches, its first courts of law, and its first state board of education, established in 1837 in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
We learned that history.
Horace Mann,
Anyway, you can start
later to
fading it
become
out
known
or
as
cut
the...
it. So while you kind of cue it up to about 4:55, the semiotics are pretty obvious, right? It's, our patrimony that's unchanging until these, outside agitators came along. So maybe you can cue 4 minutes and 55 seconds there, Daniel.
And most of them find it difficult to believe that anything as fearsome or as brazen as the rewriting of textbooks to further certain ideological goals could happen here. For who would want certain textbooks rewritten? California U.S. Congressman Charles Teague has pointed out that, quote, the Russian communists adopted this method many years ago. The communists omit from textbooks references to ideas, incidents, and individuals not in favor with the ruling regime.
That's good, Daniel.
End
Thanks.
quote.
And then next will be 6:20, so you can kind of cue that up. Last year, 2 years ago, it was kitsch. It was funny. This year, it's your life. But also think about the thought structure. Textbooks used to be true, unchanging, right? Now they're revisionist. Why can't history be the same that what we learned? And this is again that primordial stuff. People fear change. I was talking to 2 teachers yesterday who told me that when math pedagogy changes, parents lose their minds. And this is obviously the kind of moral stakes are the closeness to your heart, your sense of identity is something even kind of deeper than how you teach math. 6:20.
Submitted for adoption to various state education agencies each year. How do such textbooks come to be written? Who writes them? And what do they say? 6 University of California professors were recently selected to make evaluations of the most widely used history books in California, particularly from the standpoint of their treatment of Negroes. Their report, a 5-page collective critique titled The Negro in American History textbooks.
Oh, sorry. I was just making a little...
Provided guidelines for rewriting history according to new specifications.
I love that, Portland has paused new specifications, right? So that's how, Home of the Free comes about, and it's full of, like I say, kind of weird Cold War boilerplate about how it emphasizes the wrong things and doesn't talk about the heroic patriots who laid down their lives, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I screwed up the cue for the next one, so I'll just read it to you, but it'll kind of help me give a little bit more exegesis, and you can get 23:35 ready for when I'm done with that. So, again, the consuming purpose of the book, imagine this in the kind of booming stentorian, voice of God, old white male kind of voice. The consuming purpose of the book appears to be to develop in the child a feeling of self-incrimination or guilt because of injustices. So what are we going to do about it?
Of our schools. Examine the textbooks that are being used in the classrooms in your area. If you find passages or portions that seem to misrepresent the facts as you know them, go directly to the school authorities and ask for a thorough explanation. Textbooks are adopted.
Yeah, so I mean, now it's go to the principal's office, then go to the principal's office. Now it's install cameras, right? Send a video to Mark Levin, right? And it worked. It worked. One father said he'd rather go to jail than let his daughter be in the same room with the books. Just to give you a sense of the emotional stakes of this. How much time do I have? 1 minute. Well, so I was going to go into, and you can read about this in my book, Invisible Bridge. There was a textbook conflict in 1974 in West Virginia that culminated in the parents dynamiting the school board. Terrorism. And that's shocking. But the lesson for what I'm getting at is the Heritage Foundation was brand new. And they sent down lawyers to defend the people who were bombing the schools. And more importantly, hooked up the local activists with this national movement of textbook banners. And I was going to tell you about someone named Connie Marshner, who started the Heritage Foundation, defeated the child care bill that Richard Nixon was about to sign. And she had this great metaphor in her book, Blackboard Tyranny. I'll actually just end quickly with this quote and then sit down. Mothers have long observed that after the child starts school, the rest of the family starts catching more colds and flus, but other forms of diseases are not so evident. What about the personality traits that start developing? What about the dissatisfaction with schools and family rules and routines? What about boredom with learning loss, with learning, loss of curiosity about ideas in the world at large? Why do children suddenly begin to complain about responsibilities towards little brothers and sisters? Why do they resent doing accustomed chores? Why does off-color language or unfamiliar slang suddenly crop up in your child's conversation? As childhood yields to pre-adolescence and adolescence, but your parents are thinking this. And the condition gets worse, and parents are told that these symptoms indicate normal stages of maturation. When you get into when psychologists in the schools, the social emotional learning stuff, that gets really deep. That's when the Senate gets involved. When a mother is told by her high schooler, "You don't know what's right or wrong for me, you don't really care about me," she knows in her heart that it is something more than youthful Sturm und Drang. It is not biologically mandated for human offspring to turn against their parents. Interesting, right? But all the kids in the block are acting the same way. So Mrs. Middle America figures out she must be oversensitive until something provokes her to take a closer look at her children's public schools. And obviously, that's where you come into this story. There's always more, it's always worse, but it's never new. But in that wisdom is the beginning of a strategy to fight back, because this is the most shocking thing about my research at all. Every time this happens, both the media and the school bureaucracies and the kind of technocrats and liberals in government act like it's happening for the very first time. Thanks.
Good morning. It's great to see so many still part of the conversation. I want to just say thanks to David and to the team here at the Gilder Lehrman Center for organizing this phenomenal conference. I think that we have all found every session to be stimulating, surprising, and moving, and also really inspiring, and particularly the session yesterday afternoon with the teachers. So I am thrilled to be here and to be in conversation with teachers and others who are bearing the brunt of the attacks on honest history and inclusive education. So my work over the years, as David mentioned, has given me a kind of a long view on this phenomena of the rise of the right, so much so that we might call it the resurgence of the right or the reinvention of the right, because it goes so deep in our history. And as David Blight mentioned yesterday, to remember that we are a settler society, society that was a slave society before for more of its history than it has been a society since emancipation. So there are very deep roots here. And we could even take this story of the rise of the right back to the 1830s with the rise of a self-consciously reactionary, anti-democratic minority movement among the enslavers of the South, led by John C. Calhoun, whose Northern gentleman allies in anti-abolition mobs that literally physically attacked abolition advocates railed against those abolitionists for turning children against their parents. That was one of the critiques of the abolitionists. Or we could look at the Gilded Age in the early 20th century and the reactionary movements against public education then, or the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s, which I wrote about, which got its greatest following from engaging in moral panic and recruiting fearful parents with stories of what was happening to their children. They also had a schools campaign to force the teaching of the Protestant King James Bible to try to agitate the Catholics. Or we could look at the right-wing reaction to the New Deal, which became the foundation then of the anti-civil rights cause that first invented the trope that we hear so much today, the liberal media. That came from segregationist editors. Or we might look at Ronald Reagan's first inaugural, where, and I meant to look up the exact language and I forgot to, because there was too many interesting sessions and too much fun at dinner, but his first inaugural, where he said to his supporters that they needed to stop apologizing. Somebody may remember the exact language, but it is this continuing theme of rejecting what the right perceives as shaming for the things that they have supported. Or we could look at the panic about political correctness that came out of that refusal of shame and took off under the presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush. So US history, alas, has many prequels, as we've also just heard from others, to this cynical campaign that the attackers today are calling critical race theory. And sadly, and I think this, kind of reiterates in a different direction a point just made, reactionaries have long understood the unrivaled power of parental fear. As the most powerful emotion, parents' love for their children and fear for their safety and their futures can be turned into action once a purported threat is identified. And that is why we see so many of these iterations through history. But what I want to emphasize in my remaining time here is that a few things in our time are new and particularly dangerous and particularly concerning for these things. First, we have a self-conscious group of arch-right billionaires and multimillionaires led by the Kansas CEO of Koch Industries, Charles Koch, that has been developing over decades now, and over the last few decades has been funding an apparatus of literally hundreds of organizations, from the Heritage Foundation to the Cato Institute to the Federalist Society to Americans for Prosperity, Concerned Veterans for America, the Libre Initiative, the State Policy Network. I could go on and on. I won't. But I think it's important for us to understand that we are looking at people who have a self-consciously minority agenda a radical libertarian anti-government agenda that they know most people will not accept if they understand what it is actually about and what the end games are. So they work through these other organizations and work opportunistically to identify places where they can get popular support. I'll say more about that as I get into particulars. A second big change we need to be aware of. In many of these previous campaigns, disinformation was a kind of marginal bunch of people with a Mimeo machine, and I have been in the archives and seen those Mimeos that were churned out, or maybe for a time in the 1990s, it was people with a fax machine with their conspiracy theories. No more. Now we have Fox News network, which most communication specialists will tell you is not purveying news. It is cultivating an embattled white nationalist identity and then constantly provoking that identity into action. We also have right-wing talk radio begun by Rush Limbaugh, but now all across the airwaves, particularly in red states like mine. We have the Facebook algorithms, etc. Third, and crucial, the strategists and their backers, guided by a particular set of political economic ideas, have managed to change the rules and the incentives of our public life nearly across the board to accelerate their project. To wit, just a few examples of this. They worked for the end of the fairness doctrine in broadcasting in 1987. It's the end of the fairness doctrine in broadcasting that enables Rush Limbaugh and all of his successors, that enables Fox News. Then in turn, these outlets are engorged and have a stake in continuing what they're doing. These donors, and they're also worked for the Citizens United case, which radically changed the incentives in our politics by enabling floods of dark money, untraceable cash into public life. Shelby County decision has enabled a wave of disenfranchisement across the South and much of the country that has no parallel, other than the driving of Black men from representation in the late 19th centuries. Also, we have seen a Pincer's action in the Republican Party to drive out moderates and to ensure more and more extreme candidates. So the donors put in the dark money, Fox News, et cetera, inflame the base, and you get primaried for not being sufficiently on the extreme. And you can see this playing out, in state legislatures like mine in North Carolina and Arizona and Florida. This is a changing of the incentives that has had extraordinary consequences. Now we are seeing violent intimidation by the MAGA right, as was displayed, in the January 6 hearings, and the failure to prosecute that in any significant way yet can also be seen as a changing of incentives, because now we are seeing corporations who backed up from supporting the candidates who were the elected officials in the Republican Party who were still denying the election results even after the attack on the Capitol. They have seen there's no consequences, and now that corporate money is coming back to those individuals. So how am I doing on time? Great, okay, good. All right. Okay, good. So that's all a kind of a context. But I would like to argue that to grasp what we're seeing here so that we can deal with it effectively, we need this understanding of how strategically the radical right has been rigging the rules of governance and altering incentives to get what they want. So in effect, I think that we need to have bifocal lenses that can capture this kind of Pincer's action that has our government and so many of our schools in its grip, and to understand how that works. So again, from above, the donors and their strategist are one party. From below, we have white, Christian, conservative Americans who react to particular developments that trouble them. Then seeing that discomfort and the vote harvest it can yield, the political entrepreneurs rush to the scene, adding gasoline to the newly exposed tinder. What Rick described with the Kanawha County textbook controversy of 1974, where the Heritage Foundation rushed in, the people who were transforming the Republican Party, like William Rusher, rushed in. That is exactly what's happening now with this ginned up controversy over critical race theory, which is actually just an attack on anti-racism and honest history. So others at the conference yesterday have told us how that worked in their experience and with their research. Danielle Allen, Gloria Ladson-Billings, and Paul Ortiz. Jennifer Berkshire is going to go into the dynamics. My contribution is that to get at the deeper, less known history behind what we're seeing. Because my research for my last book took me ultimately to making sense of the huge quantities of money that are driving this mayhem, what the end game of these folks is, and what the strategy this self-consciously minority cause has employed so effectively so far is. So while there's other ways of turning the kaleidoscope, we confront, my contribution to this discussion will be to provide some political economic context, which I believe can also help extricate us from the racist zero-sum trap of those who are driving these attacks and weaponizing racism and other prejudices to do so. Okay, so let me just tell you a little bit about my own research and the circuitous route that led me to this understanding, which also goes back, as we'll see, to some things that Hassan mentioned yesterday and Gloria mentioned, particularly massive resistance to Brown versus Board of Education and the free market fundamentalism of Milton Friedman. I found those two things merging in ways that surprised me, and I imagine might surprise you. So in 2006, I was researching a story that had nothing to do with what I've just described to you. I was looking into the shutdown of public education for 5 years in Prince Edward County, Virginia, to punish Black students for having gone on a 100% solid student strike for a better high school, just as Hassan described. Their case was one of the ones that flowed into the Brown versus Board of Education decision. There was a huge reaction from the segregationist right in Virginia and across the South. Who shows up with a manifesto right in the middle of that, published in 1955, Milton Friedman, first manifesto for privatizing public education. And he did this in the full knowledge of how it would be used in the South. I know because I found in the archives an economist who challenged him. So Milton Friedman became part of my story. And the shutdowns all depended on school vouchers. So then I'm researching this story and see that there's this moderate movement led predominantly by liberal clergy, moderate right parents. They actually called it Protect Our Schools in Virginia. They try to fight off these massive resistors who are organizing private segregation academies. And another free market fundamentalist economist has just moved to Virginia. His name was James McGill Buchanan, set up a center at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville to be a kind of southern outpost of this market fundamentalist project. I hadn't heard of him. I'd heard of Friedman. I thought Friedman was where the action was, so I continued following that story, but things kept coming into my radar. So I gave a paper at University of Wisconsin, and somebody pointed out to me that the great comparative political scientist, Albert Stepan, who had been defending human rights in Chile, he said that Buchanan's Virginia school did more damage to Chile under the Pinochet dictatorship than Milton Friedman's Chicago school, about whom much had been written. So I start digging in. Well, it turns out what Buchanan did was advise on the Constitution that now hundreds of people have lost their lives over. Chile just had a constitutional convention. It didn't work, but basically he was called in to rig the rules of the Chilean Constitution so all the things the dictatorship had done while the people had no power could be preserved. Things like the privatization of education, privatization of Social Security, overrepresentation of the elite, etc. So then I'm getting more interested in Buchanan and starting to read more and more into his thinking and his proposals for action, et cetera. Then in 2010, by coincidence, I moved to North Carolina. 2010, the midterms where we saw the enthusiasm gap of the Obama years. 2010 was the year in which this right-wing network invested a fortune and managed to claim 30 states and get control. And there in the state that had just voted for Obama, and I'd been part of that as a fellow, suddenly there was this giant right turn, trying to make it with the legislature so radical, Tea Party legislature, trying to turn it into like Alabama or Mississippi. Then I was a graduate of the University of Wisconsin. That spring, Scott Walker, same playbook, starts trying to transform Wisconsin. I'm watching this and I'm like, oh my God, this is Buchanan's philosophy, public choice ideas, weaponized, put into action. But I will tell you, if any of you watched Homeland, there was a period where I thought, you're crazy. You're imagining things. You might want to go on meds. But finally, in 2013, just as the Tea Party was shutting down the federal government, I got into Buchanan's papers at George Mason University and saw all of this laid out, the connections to Koch, Buchanan's involvement with all of these organizations of the right, including the Heritage Foundation, the Federalist Society, Cato Institute. I could go on. Anyway, after the book came out in 2017, I also started getting letters from readers saying, how, as a historian, could you write something that is so predictive of all that has happened since? We can't get into that. I'll just say two things of what has happened. As soon as the Trump administration got into power, he was not on friendly terms with establishment, Republicans, whatever those are. But so there was a kind of a surround sound of people from the Koch network who went into leading positions in the Trump administration, including most obviously Vice President Mike Pence, Mark Pompeo, Mark Short. Again, could go on, no time. A second thing to point out, this came up yesterday, is the prospect of an Article 5 constitutional convention. This is something that the American Legislative Exchange Council, which Charles Koch has funded, for a very long time, along with other dirty industry corporations, they now, the efforts to line up a constitutional convention claim 28 out of the 34 states needed to authorize the first constitutional convention since 1787. And they've been organizing for this for a while. They have clear plans to dominate it. Their vision is to have every state have one delegate, which means they would dominate it, right? Because they control more states. Mark Levin, who was mentioned earlier, is a key advocate. And if they win Congress, the first gambit will be to push that through, because now they are aggregating older authorizations for Congress, even going back to 1789, and claiming that they are still active, and therefore they have like 37 as opposed to 28. So the stakes could not be higher on all of this. It is about whether we will be able to take effective federal action to defend the most popular victories of the 20th and the 21st century, whether we will be able to take action on the impending climate crisis, because Koch Industries, I neglected to mention, but many of its partners are deeply based in the fossil fuel sector and believe that they are facing an existential threat if there is action on climate change, and they are showing a willingness to weaponize any prejudice that can get them the numbers they need at the ballot. I believe in all of this. Public education and public schools are crucial for all the reasons people have outlined today. This network and Charles Koch himself, the very first thing he set up was an effort to undermine public education and a Center for Independent Schools in Wichita. Longtime funding to that. So this CRT attack, and I think Jennifer will say more about this, is also a kind of a way to push the privatization of public schools and turn parents away from them. So in my view, we are at a moment that is akin to the 1860s or to the 1930s. We are at a fork in the road in this country, and we must realize the stakes, and we must find ways of communicating those to others in our communities and take this all hands on deck emergency for democracy seriously and build it into all of the work that we try to do together to do things like save our public schools. Thank you.
Anybody need a drink before the next?
Yes. Well, my job is to whisk us into the present, and I'm going to start with a story, and it might come as a bit of a surprise after what you've just heard. But there's a particular story on the right now that conservatives have broken up with the kind of libertarianism that Nancy was just describing so eloquently. And even if you haven't heard this story, you know some of the people who are telling it. People like J.D. Vance, Blake Masters in Arizona, Josh Hawley, Marco Rubio. And the story they lay out is that the bargain that was made in the 70s, and this is what Rick chronicles in his books, where the moral majority joined forces with the kind of Friedmanite libertarians, ended up being a raw deal for the moral majority folks. That what we ended up with was a worship of the market, an ever unfolding pattern of individual rights, but the moral part of the coalition really fared pretty badly. And so, they're done. They're breaking up with libertarianism. It's over. And so, as someone who spends a lot of time paying attention to, some would say obsessively, education policy, my response to this was, because if you look around the states, the Friedman vision of education freedom is more ascendant than it ever has been. And so I would imagine that for folks in the audience like Misty Crompton from New Hampshire or our friends from Florida, hearing that the Friedman vision of education freedom and school vouchers has somehow been put aside as this coalition breaks up would come as an enormous surprise. And so in states like New Hampshire and Arizona and growing number of places, what you see is not just the traditional vision of school vouchers, which we think of as funding going to a private, usually religious school, but it's a much more expansive vision than even what Friedman himself envisioned. And they're usually called education freedom accounts or education savings accounts. And the idea is that parents can take some portion of state funding and use it for whatever they want. It could be a school, it could be homeschooling, it could be an online curriculum, it could be a for-profit micro school. But these programs are free of oversight by design. So largely we will never know where the money goes, because the idea is that the only regulators we need are parents. Arizona, a couple of months ago, passed the biggest of these programs in the country. They now have a universal voucher program, and you can already hear political leaders goading one another. Which state's going to be next? Who's going to be the next Arizona? In Michigan, where Governor Gretchen Whitmer, the Democrat, will most likely win re-election, defeating her conservative opponent, who is entirely bankrolled by the DeVos family, one of the billionaires that Nancy was mentioning. It is very likely that in the lame duck legislative session, Republican legislators will enact an enormous education savings account program over the objection of most of the public. So I want you to sort of bracket that direction in your minds. Think in one side of your minds, I want you to keep those words, education freedom. So now we're going to go to seemingly a direction of policy that is completely contradictory to that. And that would be the direction that we have been hearing so much about through the course of this conference, and I'll just shorthand it by referring to it as sort of the Ron DeSantis plan. And that is the growing warmth on the right towards using the levers of state power to drive a particular ideological project. And it's, we can trace it back, like Beverly was talking about, to Constitution Day. But you feel these legislators around the country waking up to the fact that if they've got a grievance with the public schools, here's what they can do. Bring in the patriotic curriculum, pass the Don't Say Gay law. So this, to me, like trying to reconcile how these two things are happening at the same time, often in the very same states and by the same political leaders, I have trouble wrapping my head around it. You will often hear representatives of this sort of new right, and I know that Rick will take me aside after and say, you know how many new rights there have been? In this iteration of the new right, they're wild for Hungary. Yeah. And so I saw somebody a couple weeks ago, they had one of they're often getting together and having conferences. and somebody said, another world is possible. It's called Hungary. And I always point out, homeschooling and school choice are banned in Hungary, right? Because the real autocrats move is to drive your coercive program through the schools. So how is it that these folks are doing two things at once, especially when you think about what I was describing, the lack of oversight by design? So in New Hampshire, when you get your education freedom funds, it's been set up so that there is no accountability at all. Potentially, you could use your funds to purchase for your child exactly the sort of education that the other part of your state government has just banned. So, I really have I've wondered so much about this. And I think that the answer lies in what Rick was describing in the 70s, that sort of tumult in West Virginia with the Heritage Foundation, that if your objection is really to the entire liberal project, this unfolding tapestry of rights, civil rights, the expansion of civil rights to include new groups, if you were complaining in the late 60s and early 70s about the speed of cultural change, your grievances have only deepened since then. And it was amazing to go back and look at the complaints of those parents in West Virginia. They were very unhappy about the textbooks and what was in the textbooks: feminism, multiculturalism, something we never hear about anything more about today, secular humanism. But the real, the complaint was that the culture was changing too quickly, and that you could measure this by the speed with which kids were questioning their parents. So I think that if your goal is to reverse this rights revolution, the expansion of civil rights to more and more different groups of people, then operating along these two seemingly contradictory lines actually gets you there. And when you think about the laws that these states are passing, the divisive concepts bills, the don't say gay bills, so those are focused on rolling back the rights of kids within schools. And I'm not sure how, if the public is really aware that in the US, our public schools are the locus through which civil rights are enforced, but also expanded. So when the Biden administration rolls out later this year, early next year, an expansion of Title IX protections to include transgender students, that is an expansion of civil rights being driven through the schools. And when you see lawmakers and governors limiting what teachers can teach and talk about and what bathrooms kids can use, that is an effort to use the public schools to roll back those rights. So in Virginia, for example, where Glenn Youngkin has proposed some model language for schools around the state, essentially he's saying that transgender kids who attend those schools will no longer have rights, even if their parents accept their identity as trans kids. Whether those kids have rights in the schools is up to teachers, administrators, and the larger parent community who might object to the very existence of trans kids on the grounds that it violates their religious freedom. Something we'll be hearing more about. So those are examples of where the actual infrastructures of public schools are being used to roll back rights. But then this other piece, the education freedom piece, is another way to do that. And I just want to impress upon folks that these are not small programs. In Florida, more than $1 billion is spent in public money to pay for kids to go to private religious schools or otherwise be educated outside of public schools. And it's 250,000 kids in Florida. Now that Arizona has its universal program, you'll see a growing number of states rolling out programs that apply to all kids. And the thing about these programs is that when you sign on to them, you give up your kids' rights. There is no civil rights enforcement once you're removed from the public schools. And you probably heard, one of the old themes that didn't come up today is the conservative crusade to abolish the Department of Education, the federal Department of Education. I noticed that the Freedom Caucus laying out their agenda for when they retake Congress, that was right up there at the top of the list. And I think we have a tendency to just sort of dismiss calls for the abolishment of the Department of Education as just, oh, they're a bunch of cranks, right? They've always said that. Betsy DeVos would, she would go on the trail and she would say, I'm the only Secretary of Education who's called for the abolition of the department that I run. And the people in the audience would go wild. But when you abolish the Federal Department of Education, you also abolish their Office of Civil Rights. You abolish the ability to track whether kids are being treated differently and whether they are being, say, bullied because they're lesbian or transgender or identify in some other way. So once you're removed from the public system, this entire architecture disappears. So you might be attending a private religious school where they can just send out a letter, as happened this year in Florida, saying, you know what, we don't accept lesbian or gay students because it's not in the Bible. And so if you're a parent and you have a student who identifies this way, you're going to need to find somewhere else to go. And these are schools that are being funded with public money. So that whole ability to enforce student civil rights disappears. And one of the major goals is to increase the number of kids in homeschooling, because what better way to keep kids from turning against their parents than for the parents to determine down to the individual lesson what the kids are going to be taught. And one of the really alarming things about that isn't just the indoctrination part, but that there are the privatization of rights, that kids are being subjugated in the very structure of their schooling. So if your goal is to roll back this revolution of civil rights that you've been complaining about since the 60s and 70s, and you are still really mad that prayer got booted out of the public schools, both of these tracks serve you really well. And there's one more piece to it. One of the things that makes me chortle about the claim that the libertarians are somehow on the outs with the conservatives is that if you're in a state like New Hampshire, they completely dominate the political discourse. And their refrain is always that we spend way too much on public schools. What a waste. And they've got this chart from Cato that they just love. They bring it out constantly, and it shows spending going up and up and up, and results staying the same. And what they never say is that a huge part of the reason that our public school spending has gone up is because we've vastly expanded the kinds of kids who can participate in it, including, most significantly, kids with special needs, who, not that long ago had no right to an education at all. And so what's really alarming when you go to a place like New Hampshire and you hear their Libertarian Commissioner of Education talk about his vision of the future, somehow kids with special needs never seem to come up. And so one of the, I think, most alarming things about this vision of shifting so many kids into a private sphere that's free of any oversight is that parents also sign away those rights. They sign away their rights under the Individuals with Disabilities Act, the IDEA Act, and they have absolutely no recourse when their kids are denied an education. And so as you watch this push start to take shape in all these states, keep that in mind. And then obviously, if you think we spend too much money on public education and your goal is to spend a lot less, somebody else has to pick up the bill. And the answer in all these states is that parents are going to pick up a greater percentage of the bill, because it doesn't cost $7,000 to educate a kid. It doesn't cost $4,000 as you get in New Hampshire. And so if you're a family of means, this is a nice coupon for you. But if you're not, it means that you're expected to pick up the bill. Perhaps you'll need some loans, right? Well, that it'll be more like our higher ed market. Or perhaps you'll just end up with some cheap online education. You know, the answer is ABC Mouse. So to leave you on a hopeful note, so the one thing I think that is inspiring about this, people hate this, as Nancy mentioned. This vision is really, really unpopular. And when people catch wind of it, they come together often across party lines because they don't like it. And as much as we can see people getting worked up over curriculum, et cetera, and we're alarmed by the parents' rights movement, take a look at what is happening in red states, where you have Republican governors running on sweeping school choice initiatives that will undercut rural schools. Watch rural voters buck their own party and political leaders. And that, to me, is where the inspiration lies, but also that as we plot the fight back against these horrible laws, it's so important that we understand that it's not just about gagging teachers. It's not just about keeping honest history out of schools. It's about rolling back the entire 20th century. Whether it's women's rights and gay rights, it just happens that because schools are the locus for enforcing and expanding those rights, that's where the fight is. And the more we can call attention to the hugeness of the vision, the more we can help people see how awful it is and encourage them to fight it. So thank you.
Great. People have forgotten how much Ronald Reagan ran against the system. I have a lot of questions for this. I'm going to open it right up to the audience because you must be eager to ask anything. Yes? Let's get the mic though, because otherwise our large live stream, our large live stream audience won't be hearing you.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Cynthia.
This question is for the entire panel. Dr. MacLean, when you were talking about things that are new, a question that I have is kind of based on a personal anecdote, where because I teach as a history professor at a liberal arts college, I have been told repeatedly, you are part of the problem. My question is about then the disdain, even the venomous contempt that now exists for expertise. We know that there's an anti-intellectual tradition. What is different about it today? Or is it just new wine, old wineskins?
Thank you. That is such an important question. And there is, there are certainly elements of this that go way back in terms of public willingness and sometimes motivation to believe things that are factually untrue. But disinformation has become a huge industry in our country. And in terms of the story that I was telling, I didn't emphasize it as much in Democracy in Chains. I've learned much more since the book came out because I've become involved with environmental groups, people dealing with climate change, a whole range of organizations, including people in other countries who are facing the international aspect of all of this. But it's really important to know that Koch Industries was involved in climate science denial, going back at least to 1991, and that whole industry was terrified as the public came to understand that climate change was a real threat. It was called global warming then, and there was a brief moment of bipartisanship when George Herbert Walker Bush recognized that it was an issue. The public was, something like 75, I think, or 80%, concerned, willing to do things. And then these guys went, whoa, this is an existential threat. The journalist Chris Hayes has made a really interesting point in terms of the amount of sunk cash that they have in investments and potential loss of future profits, saying the only analog in our history is the enslavers on the eve of the Civil War. 2 trillion, it's actually the same number Chris Hayes pointed out. So we are talking about really motivated actors who have spread disinformation, who have glommed onto this notion of don't trust the liberal media, who have purposely propounded disinformation on multiple fronts and seen the yield, including for, promoting the myth of voter fraud. Many they were the ones who actually organized the resistance to the Clinton healthcare plan with disinformation in the 1990s. We just didn't know them then. It was Citizens for a Sound Economy. But anyway, so that is a huge problem that we are up against in terms of disinformation. Also, the people who are thinking very strategically in these groups, and they have lots of funding to sit around and think of ideas, they are seriously disrupting places they feel they cannot control. Higher education is also one of those. So there are over 300 campuses now where there are at least some people receiving Koch funding. There are Koch centers all over. I write about the flagship one at George Mason in the second to last chapter of my book. They are weaponizing these spaces and also funding scholarship that attacks the value of education, right? And going back to this notion of changing the incentives and creating Pincer's actions, there's a group that is called the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, ACTA, which was actually set up by Lynn Cheney sometime before, but now it is deeply supported by a lot of these corporate actors who feel like the university is threatening to them. And they have been also helping to gin up these free speech fights, which then students behave badly, and then the donors go to the administrators and say, see, your kids don't even believe in the Bill of Rights. That's why you need a center for, a Koch center, a free enterprise. Now they've rebranded, they're calling it eudaimonia, flourishing and all these names. So they've learned over time, but they are creating these bastions in particular universities and then using them to wreck some of the regular curriculum. They've done that at Arizona State University, many other places. Actually, just on that, there's a great book called Free Speech and Koch Money, by a faculty member who saw this up close and is one of the co-founders of Unkoch My Campus. I would highly recommend that to get a sense of the actors and how to track them. Sorry for the long answer.
That's okay. I want to make sure.
There's a lot of effort going on out there.
I want to make sure we get to as many questions as possible, so let's all try to.
Do you have a thought on that? Well, I have one quick thought that one thing that I think is new, both in terms of higher education and then in terms of public education, is that the advocacy of the existence of public schools and of universities in general is increasingly a partisan issue, right? And so, and that seems to me to be really troubling, that you in contrast to 50 years ago, where you were having fights about the nature of education, the existence and the desirability of even having a state university system, those sorts of things are increasingly partisan. I think it's not great. There's a conservative critique of the kind of liberal academy, as you're talking about, and that seems to me to be of less concern. I think it is a concern that actually people employed in education are so heavily in one political party, and that creates real structural problems in the politics that I think look quite different because of the ways the parties have changed than they did 50 years ago.
Yeah, I'll talk.
Right, go ahead.
My next book is going to be about basically how we got this way in the 21st century, and it's called The Infernal Triangle. And the triangle is, the authoritarian right wing that we're talking about. And I think that not much has changed about their ideas about expertise, or shall we say weaponizing popular fears of expertise. You hear them, Walker Evans, the Klan guy, you hear him kind of saying similar things. What has, Hiram, yes, thank you. What has changed and evolved and got us to this place is the other corners of the triangle. The first is the Democrats kind of retreat from the New Deal tradition, hyper obsession with kind of compromise with the right, whether it was Clintonian triangulation, the whole Obama project, where they kind of meet him halfway, that just made it easier for them to spit on him, And then the third part of the triangle is the absolute moral and kind of operational collapse of journalism into basically, you can just shorthand it as kind of both sides journalism. that basically give a free rein to bad actors because they're one side of a quote unquote two-sided debate. 2 + 2 = 4, that's what the Democrats say. Republicans say 2 + 2 = 5. Maybe it's 4.5. It's halfway in between.
Wow, let's get to as many questions as we can, so let's all try to be as succinct as we can. I see Jason over here, and I guess,
Well, there's the mic.
I'm sorry, okay, who's got the mic?
I do right now, and I'll try to be very quick.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your panel. Someone recently said, there's a lot of disdain for higher education, which I fully agree. I live in a small town in the Adirondacks, and if my neighbors heard this panel, taking time off from their landscaping and paper milling and deer butchering businesses that pay them well and make them believe in the American dream, they would hear a lot of disdain for small town values, that kind of life. And so I'm curious, I've had to talk a lot about Civil War recently, and so when people ask me, was Robert E. Lee an honorable man? I say, what if he won? What would happen if he had actually won? And that 30-second, 5-second elevator pitch really makes people think. So my question for this panel is, when they ask me about what I was doing at Yale down here, or why the nativity scene can't be up on our town library anymore, what is my succinct answer? I'll think of my own if I can, but that helps them understand these things without letting them feel attacked, that tries to talk across the aisle.
So how do we talk to our Trump voting cousins?
Yes, in that.
Well, Nancy and I were talking before this about this inspiring story that came out of Croydon, New Hampshire, which Ms. Tina is all about. Because I actually think that the defense of public education is one of the few issues that actually does bring people together across party lines. What happened in Croydon was that New Hampshire is essentially under occupation now by libertarians, and they hold more and more positions of power. So at the local level, one of them figured out a way to slash the school budget by half. And so it meant that kids, parents were gonna have to foot the bill to send their kids to public schools. And so what unfolded was this amazing organizing effort that required people going door to door and convincing their neighbors about the power of local schools. And what ended up happening was the single largest gathering in this town's history, as people got together and they repealed that vote. And what was so cool about it was that, the woman going door to door also had an enormous Trump sign in her yard. And it tells me that we're missing something fundamental about this story. And that the goal is to keep everybody focused on the things that make your neighbors look down upon, as opposed to the fact that that school in your community is it's the glue that holds it together. And once it's gone, that community is also gonna die. Something that people in rural communities, I think, really understand.
I'd say also real quickly, just to go back to where I started my remarks, is that people want to see themselves in history, right? And so that actually by taking seriously historicizing, right, that this person's values are not necessarily like anyone's values, some, timeless, seamless, heartland values, small town values, but that, that has a history too. People want to see themselves in history. They want to study themselves often as historical subjects. And I think that by thinking in historical terms and using kind of historical tools, that can be really empowering because for a wide variety of actors, but because those values are often presented as somehow timeless, ahistorical, and then somehow unrepresented in a lot of the history that we tell. People can't see themselves as actors in history either. So I don't think we're necessarily engaged in different projects all the time.
Who's got the mic next? Well, okay. Well, no, Jason's got it over here. We'll go over here and then over there. Jason.
Just quickly, Professor MacLean already addressed this a little, but I'm worried about the international aspect and why there's just, I'm worried that we're just focusing on the United States. We're so far behind the far right, who, I mean, they're looking to Hungary because they shoved the best university of Hungary out of the country and to Vienna. And when we focus, I yesterday I spoke to reporters in Poland and Brazil, and they're dealing with the same things. And as long as we just focus on the US and not think about the international context, we are just clearly behind the far right.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, my next book is about that. And there is something called, it's not to really depress you, can you bring out the bourbon or whatever we need? But there is something called the Atlas Network, which was built up after 1981, now operates in over 90 countries, over 450 affiliates. And they over and over again, funded by fossil fuel sector, other dirty industries who are hostile to government regulations, trying to get away from it, who engage in systematic disinformation. So actually there's kind of the book, but I'm also working with a number of people in the climate change world, Climate Social Science Network and others who also operate transnationally to get ahead of this because, and maybe the hope story here is that in place after place, they are creating these things and making them look like they are organic. They also do this, by the way, with the religious right, with something called the Alliance Defending Freedom. There's a ton of donor money coming in. They're finding local, indigenous actors to partner with, matching funds, blah, blah, blah. The people who are involved, the operatives cycle back and forth between their countries and the US to take this training. And I also actually commissioned some initial research last year because I had this hypothesis that there was a connection to these reactionary populist efforts that we're seeing in place after place. And lo and behold, it's not an exact match, but there's very strong involvement of at least some affiliates, including Bolsonaro. Actually, we all forgot Berlusconi in the 90s. He was the first one. Yes, I mean, that is happening. It is transnational. If you're interested, I can tell you more. You can look it up, but also the people in the climate change world understand our emergency like no other. And I've spoken to people across the spectrum of progressive politics, but they get it. And they are the people to look to, I think, for the cutting edge, including litigation strategies on a lot of this stuff.
Can I do an online question?
Yeah.
Sure.
There's 7 online questions. I mean, it's Saturday. You know what teachers do on Saturday.
Yeah, they come to conferences online at Yale.
I think, and I've got a lot of other questions from past panels. I think what I'll do is during lunch, see if we can print off all of the questions and disseminate them to everyone because, but there's lots of conversation in the room as well.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Sure.
I thought this was fascinating. I'm a history teacher in Virginia, but before that I was in education policy, so I sort of lived some of this and researched some of it. And one thing I was thinking about was how after the Civil War, Alexander Stevens wrote a textbook. And I know I asked you about this a long time ago, Dr. Blight, but Frederick Douglass was very concerned about what was going to go in textbooks. And it seems like at the root of all of this is sort of this lost cause, mentality. I didn't hear that come up so much, but sort of the disdain for federal power, the hatred of Yankee liberals, the anti-equity vibe, and it just gains traction with every other social movement. Obviously, anti-communism being probably the biggest one, which they still come back to today. And my question, I'm sorry, I'm one of those people who's making a comment instead of a question, but I do have a question. How do we leverage the history for the pro-public education side? Because it seems like the right has really been able to leverage it so well.
I'll start with something that actually, Jennifer, you said something funny. You said, "Oh, well, I'm going to be all pedantic and say, oh, this is not the new right. The new right was in the 70s." I think that one way to maybe talk about this is ask people or invite people to think why the right is always rebranding itself. Because every time they get any modicum of power, some kind of moral, economic, military disaster follows. It's like when the first people to be called a new right, the people around William F. Buckley in the 50s. This was after McCarthy. This was kind of during massive resistance, so they had to kind of massage that. It was after, if you listen to Rachel Maddow's new podcast, about basically half the Republican Party being revealed to be in bed with Nazi Germany, you know. And then, you know, you've got, you know, the disasters of Watergate, you get what, you know, it's kind of like the high new right of the 1970s. And then after Bush fails, you get the Tea Party, and now we have this new right after, you know, the disasters of, you know, kind of Trump and his kind of failures, so they kind of have to rebrand that, you know, with obviously borrowing Trump. So I think, you know, one way to think about it is ask people what happens. Yeah, this I like that Robert E. Lee answer. What happens or what would happen if these people had power? So this is a little thought I had.
I add just one more thing to that. It's really empowering to look back and see why these movements sputtered in the past. So as Rick mentioned, you know, the media covers parents' rights like it just was born yesterday. But we went through a whole version of this in the 90s. And what happened was that as people gained insight into where the demands would lead, either privatizing public schools or enforcing a narrow religious vision, the sort of generic language of parents' rights gets less and less appealing. And so I think it's really empowering to go back and look at that and find out, like, where's the similarity today? Because you'll see, like, nothing brings people together like their opposition to vote bans. So hammer on that.
Yeah.
Can I follow up on that?
Okay,
Two
go ahead.
sentences. One is that, so I think as historians and history teachers, we're very good at teaching what happened. We're not so good at teaching how. And I think if you turn to the how question and say, as Jennifer suggested, as others have suggested, how in fact was this change that you like achieved? How was this change that you didn't like achieved? Then you have a set of tools that history can teach you that allow you to think about change in the present.
And I would add to the how, it's a brilliant point, Beth. And then we're gonna have to wrap up and go get coffee, and then you can all talk. But it seems to me we learned the punctuations you have all talked about, the markers you have all talked about. Jennifer, the New Hampshire case, I mean, you're suddenly, there was in effect a panic from the left that said, wait a minute, you libertarians, this far and no farther, because there was some event. And, you know, I've been teaching too long, but the more and more and more and more we do this, how does change actually happen? It happens when something shocking makes us act. And the right, I mean, I was gonna ask earlier for all of you, you've all been answering, why is the right so much better at this than liberals? Why is the right, it's money for sure.
Well, we also don't lead from our values enough. As
No, we don't.
George Lakoff and messaging people would
We got
say.
afraid of the word value.
They say truth sandwich, lead from your values. People who know how to do this stuff better. Lead from your values, have the substance in the middle, and come back to the values or, you know, what it means for people's lives. And we tend to be wonky instead and not do that, but we must.
Not only that, yeah, you're right. I mean, we got afraid of words like that. We got afraid of the word liberalism. Nobody needs to, we gotta be progressives now. We can't be liberals anymore. We keep inventing words for ourselves because the other side makes us. I would just say, you know, the big turns in this stuff come when there's something that shocks us. I hate admitting that. Fort Sumter, Pearl Harbor, 9/11, Trump's election. I mean, and I don't know what the next shock is. Next week.
I know we're pressed for time, but can I just float a question after we can just walk out with?
Float it, we'll get coffee, and
there we go.
And they're all gonna come for you.
No, that's why I'm asking the question. So we have posed the thought, and you had shared actually. So you know, how do we talk to our cousins? Ain't my cousin. Right. I gotta talk to them. I mean, when we look at this, you know, all the iterations of the new right and the new right and new right, the one group that has been consistently questioning and not falling as a group for what is being pitched has been African Americans.
True, but you might have a cousin in Georgia who might vote for Rachel. I've been watching that.
Now, I will say, at various moments, part of that pitch and appeal has peeled off increasing numbers. Block grants, for example, right, in the 1990s, you saw that number jump. But consistently as a whole, despite some of these dips, we've seen African Americans, not falling for it. So my question is simply, is there something that we can learn from how they interpret and understand sort of this right pitch and appeal that can help your cousins deal with these issues going forward?
Fabulous question to take to coffee.
What can we learn from the Black protest tradition?
Yeah.
Which is what we're always going on to fight on. Yes, great, good question, man. All right, time for coffee. Thank you, panel. Exciting.